My dear ones, let us dredge up, for no good reason whatsoever, one of the thorniest, most difficult historical problems in the Old Testament, involving the Bible in this corner, narrating a particular story in a very particular way, multiple times in different books. And then in this corner, a rival empire, the Assyrians, narrating the same event, but with different facts. So a tale tailor-made for our era of niche news sources and so on. Apparently this sort of thing has been going on for a long time. We have two rival communities with just different, not just different interpretations of the same event maybe, but different, just different core claims about what is even real. Two rival realities. I refer, of course, to the Assyrian siege of Hezekiah in the city of Jerusalem around the year 701 BC. Or did I say BCE? Is it BC or BCE? Some people get very riled up about this. I said both. I said neither. 2,700 years ago. One thing that's very fascinating about this, about these two rival interpretations or factual narrations of this event, is that they actually seem to agree on some core things. So let's start with what these sources agree upon. Check down below for links to these sources and these texts, and you can follow this trail yourself if you'd like. They agree that the Assyrians were out on the campaign under a particular Assyrian king named Sennacherib around the year 701 BC. They both agree that Sennacherib came to Jerusalem and even the surrounding area as well, and wreaked some havoc, did some destruction. We have archaeology, which would exist independently of the biblical narration. Maybe we wouldn't have known where to look or how to interpret the archaeology in light of a particular event without the Bible, but nevertheless, we have archaeology independently confirming with Assyrian, military things and burned destruction layers dating to this time period and these places. We pretty much know that something happened here. The Assyrians came, Sennacherib came. The Assyrians have inscriptions in which Sennacherib himself brags and says, I came and I did this plundering and I came to Judah and did these things. We also have the Bible itself narrating that Sennacherib, and particularly Sennacherib, came and did some plundering and whatnot and did these things. Sennacherib and Hezekiah had some particular encounter, and it turned out that the Assyrians left, and it turned out that Jerusalem was not destroyed, and it turned out that Hezekiah paid some kind of tribute to the Assyrians. These are things I think that both of these sources absolutely agree to. Now you could say that they have a little bit of a different coloring kind of around the edges, or even further toward the center than around the edges about this. So for example, to hear the Assyrians narrate this, I'll look here in this Context of Scripture volume, to what the translator, editor here, Mordecai Kogan, calls maybe the most discussed Neo-Assyrian inscription here, recounting Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem. This is the earliest copy of it is the so-called Rassam cylinder, dates to around the year 700 BCE. So only like a half of a year after these hostilities would have ended. So very close. We're pretty sure that this narration is very close to the event itself. Doesn't mean more accurate, but very historically close. This description begins, in my third campaign, I marched, I did these things. So just to hear the language of the inscription, I'll pick up later on when he starts narrating, when Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, starts narrating the encounter with the Judahite king, Hezekiah. As for Hezekiah, the Judean, I besieged 46 of his fortified walled cities and surrounding smaller towns, which were without number. Using packed down ramps and applying battering rams, infantry attacks by mines, breaches, and siege machines, I conquered them. I took out 200,150 people, young and old, male and female, horses, mules, donkeys, camels, cattle, and sheep, without number, and counted them as spoil. That number seems kind of outrageous for people. I don't know that the entire population of the entire land would have been 200,150. It's a very specific number. I don't know where they're getting that number from. Does he also mean the animals? I don't know what that means. He himself, Hezekiah, he continues, I locked up within Jerusalem, his royal city, like a bird in a cage. I surrounded him with earthworks and made it unthinkable for him to exit by the city gate. His cities which I had despoiled, I cut off from his land and gave them to Metinti, king of Ashdod, Padi, king of Ekron, and Silibel, king of Gaza, and thus diminished his land. I imposed dues and gifts for my lordship upon him in addition to the former tribute, their yearly payment. He, Hezekiah, was overwhelmed by the awesome splendor of my lordship, and he sent me after my departure to Nineveh, my royal city, his elite troops, his best soldiers. He gave me lots of things, huge boatloads of silver and gold and more, and it just goes on and on like that. So fascinating that you have a major world empire mentioning Judah, mentioning Hezekiah. I mean, here you have an important touch point for biblical historiography. These are definitely real people. These are definitely real things that are happening. There's no reason that the Assyrians would have made up an encounter like this. There's debate in the world of Assyriologists and of Near Eastern scholars and even biblical scholars about whether Assyrian inscriptions like this actually would have made up information or lied, or whether they just exaggerated things and provided a very a veneer of propaganda and a certain kind of interpretation upon things. But this seems rock solid that these kind of things would have happened. Okay, so why did I tease at the beginning that this is a very thorny problem of biblical history, and people debate the veracity of the Bible over this issue? Because when this is narrated in the Bible, we have different details. That's fine. We have some different things. That's fine. We have Hezekiah paying tribute and doing things, and that's totally fine. And we have essentially Hezekiah not dying during the siege and the city of Jerusalem not being burned to the ground or anything like that. But I mean, here's the big thing. I'll read from the account in 2 Kings 19, although this is also in Isaiah, also in Chronicles. After Isaiah the prophet is there, prophesying and helping Hezekiah kind of mentally and emotionally and spiritually through this issue, this is what happens. The prophet Hezekiah says this strong word about the Assyrian king. He shall not enter this city. He shall not take it. Verse 34, I will protect and save this city for my sake and for the sake of my servant David, using the JPS Jewish Study Bible translation here for no particular reason. Verse 35, that night an angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the Assyrian camp, and the following morning they were all dead corpses. So King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and retreated and stayed in Nineveh and left. He goes back home and is assassinated. And we know from Assyrian records actually that he really was assassinated, but probably like 19 years, 20 years after this event, whereas the Bible doesn't say really when he was assassinated, but maybe makes it sound like it happened right afterward or something like that. But there were some 2 decades. Okay, but what about this thing about the 185,000 Assyrian troops being struck dead by an angel of the Lord on the eve of the battle? There are several things that are wild about this. It would be hard for the Assyrians to brag about any kind of victory when something like that occurs. Why would Hezekiah have been paying tribute to the Assyrians if their entire army died? How big was this army anyway? Difficult to get a number. Assyrian inscriptions didn't often count their own troops in a coherent way. We can guess. I mean, a guess would be something like their standing army might have had 100,000 or 150,000 troops in it. And then on campaign, they might have gone out with 20,000 or 40,000 or 50,000 troops. So the idea of 185,000 here is spectacular for sure. A kind of a side detail that's really fascinating, or maybe more than a side detail, is that the Greek historian Herodotus, I think in something around 500 BC, has a Greek history written around that time in which he tells a story about Sennacherib going down to Egypt, where the Assyrians really did campaign, and actually having a similar problem in Egypt. He doesn't narrate the biblical story, but he talks about Sennacherib going down to Egypt, and overnight a bunch of mice attack the Assyrian camp and eat their shields and swords and food and stuff. Maybe it's a metaphor for plague or sickness. And the Assyrian army basically has nothing, and they are terribly defeated by the Egyptians right after that event, as one would imagine. So you have kind of like an odd parallel there. And there might have been some storytelling tradition in the ancient Near Eastern world about this miraculous defeat of the Assyrian army that gets garbled or reflected and refracted in these different traditions. Don't really know what to make of that. it seems hard to square these two accounts with one another and say, well, they're just both kind of telling a story from different perspectives. It's like, yeah, the 185,000 dead troops, that for me, that's the sticking point that makes me feel, with whatever historical sensibility I have, that we can't just say, well, they're just, each side is kind of spinning this in their own way. I mean, clearly they're doing that. Okay, final act here. Enter an article that I just saw on the Bible and Interpretation website, linked below, kind of farming this article here for my idea in a sense. An article by Paul Evans of McMaster Divinity College. This is drawn from a book called Sennacherib and the War of 1812, Disputed Victory in the Assyrian Campaign of 701 BCE in Light of Military History. What this scholar does is basically uses the War of 1812 as an analogy for this war, for thinking about how can historians think through this problem. And I'll give you a shortcut. You can read the article, but I'll give you a shortcut to Evans's conclusion. The War of 1812, I had to revisit the Wikipedia page on the War of 1812 to just remind myself, like, what was that? In a time of heightened tensions between the US and Canada, the War of 1812 is kind of an interesting one to think about. This was the US versus Great Britain, the empire, which had Canada as a territory. And so Canada was kind of like the battleground of the war. But the war was really important for Canadian self-identity and so on. But really, in the end, Great Britain / Canada claimed victory in the War of 1812, but so did the United States. So it makes a fertile analogy for Evans to think about how two sides could enter a conflict with a lot of overlapping facts and details, but have very different takeaways from, well, in this battle, we lost more troops, but we won more territory, so therefore we call it a victory, and therefore, and in the end, Evans asks us to consider what might the Assyrians have considered a victory against Judah. It might not have involved having to depose King Hezekiah or ruin Jerusalem completely, just in order to kind of pacify the area, destroy it a little bit, extract some tribute payment and leave. Whereas what would have been seen as a victory for Judah in their own eyes, regardless of what Assyria thought or what an outside observer might have thought. Well, the victory there clearly, and it reverberates throughout biblical texts actually, is the idea that God saved Jerusalem and the capital was preserved. And you get something here like a kind of a mythology in ancient Judah of an inviolability, an undefeatability of the city of Jerusalem. A belief that, in fact, Judahites must have held on to so strongly that prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah actually had a hard time dislodging that view from the minds of those living in Jerusalem around the year 586 BCE, when in fact the Babylonians were ready to destroy the city. And Jeremiah was like, God has sent the Babylonians, they're going to destroy it. And then other prophets were saying, no, God will always protect this place. Remember Hezekiah, remember the Assyrians, right? And in the end, Paul Evans wants to suggest this War of 1812 analogy of the two sides is really a fruitful metaphor for us to think about how we could think of this historically. And he shows how different scholars have lined up on either side saying, the Bible is lying. See, you can see they just made up this number, 185,000 and so on, versus, oh no, the Assyrians, they had to go home with their tail between their legs and they didn't do what they accomplished. And see, the Bible is just always true and, under certain views and so on. Paul Evans doesn't really, I think he takes an approach which I think he wants to say, no, we don't have to come down hard on either side quite like that. And he ends at least the excerpt article here on the website version, as you can see, by saying essentially in his conclusion, by using this analogy of the War of 1812, we can see that neither Assyrian nor biblical texts were principally deceptive in their presentation. I guess the question I would want to put to it is, what about the 185,000 troops? Maybe you just see this as kind of like, this is the kind of language that these texts would use for numbers. They could exaggerate numbers, they could use numbers in various kinds of ways. But I like the idea of using this analogy, and what I like about this is that there are facts that are just difficult or indeed impossible now for us to really know. And what we have are groups contending for a story. And we've talked about that theme here on the channel before, this idea that history can be seen as what happened, like in a very positivistic sense, like the way that we think of historical facts with journalism and cameras and reporting today. But there's another very productive way of thinking about history, which might have been more like the way that people thought about history in the ancient world, which is that history, yes, it happened, But it's really about storytelling. And history ends up being, as much as anything, about interpretation and about belief.